Sophie stepped into the quiet sanctuary of her new apartment with a deep exhale, hoping it would mark the beginning of a calmer life. She needed the stillness. Her recent breakup had left her drained, and the idea of solitude was as comforting as the warm glow of the late afternoon sun flooding through the wide windows. From her vantage point, she could see a small park across the street, sparsely used and framed by tall, dark trees. The sight was peaceful, she thought, as she started unpacking her belongings. The first night passed uneventfully. She found the area unusually quiet, almost eerily so. The faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog were the only sounds breaking the stillness. While brushing her teeth before bed, she glanced out the window and noticed a shadowy figure standing in the park. It looked like a man, standing very still under one of the dim streetlights. She squinted, but couldn't make out much, just a tall silhouette, seemingly looking in her direction. Dismissing it as a passerby or a harmless loiterer, Sophie turned off the lights and went to bed, her new life finally beginning. The man appeared again the following night. Sophie was lounging on her sofa, scrolling through her phone, when an odd feeling of being watched pulled her attention to the window. The shadowy figure was back in the same spot, standing unnaturally still under the streetlight. This time, she noticed something peculiar. His head seemed to tilt slightly toward her window, almost like he was observing her. She closed the blinds and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. On the third night, he was closer. Sophie had only intended to look outside briefly, but her gaze was immediately drawn to the figure. He was now standing near the edge of the park, close enough for her to notice a faint but unnerving detail, a wide grin, faintly glowing in the dark. It wasn't normal, she thought. A trick of the light, perhaps. Yet the sight lingered in her mind long after she retreated from the window, pulling the curtains shut with a trembling hand. Deciding she'd had enough, Sophie bought thick curtains the next day. If she couldn't see him, maybe he wouldn't bother her, she reasoned. But that night, she made a horrifying discovery. While brushing her teeth, she glanced at the mirror above the sink and froze. There he was, standing just behind her reflection, his unnaturally wide grin faintly glowing in the glass. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but the bathroom was empty. Sophie spent hours checking every room, every lock, every possible point of entry. No one was there, but the reflection stayed with her. She avoided looking in the mirror again that night, sleeping with every light in the apartment turned on. Over the next few days, she began noticing him in other mirrors, always just behind her reflection. Sometimes he was further back, other times disturbingly close. Yet every time she turned around, she found herself alone. The unease escalated into terror as the days went on. Sophie tried everything to feel safe. She bought cameras and set them up around the apartment, hoping to catch any sign of an intruder. But the footage showed nothing. The man wasn't outside her window, nor inside her home, at least not in a way the cameras could detect. Despite her precautions, the presence grew more intense. Scratching sounds came from the walls at night. Shadows flitted just outside her line of sight. The man's grin started to haunt her dreams, always glowing, always watching. When she woke up, the same grin would greet her in the reflective surface of her phone screen or the dark glass of the television. Isolation gripped her. Sophie stopped leaving the apartment altogether, afraid that if she stepped outside, he might follow her back in a more corporeal form. Her mind began to play tricks on her. Was that creak in the floorboards real? Did the shadows in the corner move, or was it her imagination? Desperate for answers, Sophie turned to the internet, scouring forums and local history websites for any explanation of what she was experiencing. The park across the street had a history, she learned. Decades ago, a man who lived in her building had been known for his strange behavior. He would stand in the park at night, staring at the windows of the surrounding apartments with an unsettling grin. Neighbors had reported him for harassment, but nothing was ever done. One night, he vanished. His body was later found in the park, his grin frozen in death, stretched wider than humanly possible. The stories claimed that his spirit lingered, drawn to the building where he'd once lived, his grin a symbol of the madness that consumed him in life. As Sophie read the accounts, the pieces clicked into place. She wasn't just being haunted, she was being targeted. The man was feeding on her fear, growing closer with each passing night. Determined to end the nightmare, Sophie decided to confront him. Armed with a flashlight and all the courage she could muster, she ventured into the park for the first time since moving in. The night was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. She approached the spot where she'd first seen him, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the shadowy corner, he was waiting. The man's grin glowed brighter now, illuminating his grotesque features. His body was impossibly thin, his limbs distorted, as though they had been stretched by some unseen force. His eyes were dark voids, but Sophie could feel them boring into her. The man began to move toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. Sophie froze, unable to run, her legs rooted to the ground. His grin widened further, an inhuman expression of triumph. Sophie fled back to her apartment, but the man was faster. His grin followed her into every mirror, every shadow, every corner of her mind. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, warped by his presence. She screamed, clawing at the covered mirrors, but there was no escape. The last thing Sophie saw before the darkness claimed her was his reflection, grinning triumphantly as it overtook her own. The apartment was listed for rent a month later. A young couple moved in, drawn by the affordable price and the building's quiet reputation. On their first night, as they unpacked their belongings, one of them glanced out the window and noticed a man standing in the park. He was barely visible in the shadows, but his wide grin seemed to glow faintly in the dark.